What exactly is happening in Ukraine? We hear in our media here in the United States that Ukraine is winning, yet its leader Volodymyr Zelensky is saying that his counteroffensive is not going as planned. We also notice that the U.S. keeps sending weapons, well, another $1.8 billion being discussed since the promise of old cluster bombs 2 weeks ago. President Biden told CNN that the controversial old bombs were necessary because Ukraine and the U.S. were running out of other munitions in the 155 millimeter category. We hear that defense contractors, Raytheon, are calling back retirees in their late 70s to instruct current employees on how to actually build new or better or more missiles. We hear that Ukraine lost 16 Bradley fighting vehicles that the U.S. provided in one fight, yet we see images of heavy Russian losses as well. We hear that the proxy regime in Kiev is gaining ground against Vladimir Putin, but it's losing a lot of equipment, while we're told that Russia is suffering lots of casualties as well. To me, somehow, there's a disconnect between the reporting we see for this war and what's reality. Maybe that happens in every war. Maybe that's the fog of war. I don't know. I'm not an expert. But it's not adding up to me. So I thought I would bring in an expert, somebody who's actually traveled to Ukraine recently and many times in the past. His name is Dr. Matthew Schmidt, National Security and Political Science professor at the University of New Haven, recently quoted in European outlets like Euronews. Good evening, Dr. Schmidt. Thank you so much for joining us today on WCBM.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, you've been to Ukraine recently, and you've been there in the past before COVID. Can you sort of explain the layout and what it was like and what you saw the last time you were there?
Sure. I was most recently in Kyiv, Dnipro, and Lviv in February. I was there the week that Biden arrived. Of course, didn't know he was arriving until he was there. And I was meeting with government officials about a reconstruction project. Previously, I've been back and forth to Ukraine several times. I've taken student groups there since 2014. And I was also a representative to the OSCE. That's the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I was an election monitor in 2014 after the previous president was toppled and they had an election to elect President Poroshenko. And then I was there again in 19 when Zelensky was elected.
Wow. So you were an election monitor on the election in 2014, the disputed where people say that we sort of helped facilitate a coup. What was that election actually like?
Yeah, so the OSCE is an organization that actually includes Russia. Part of what they do is they certify elections. So we go and we are poll monitors, and we're paying attention to make sure that ballot boxes aren't being stuffed, that people aren't being prevented from voting. They're watching access to advertising on state TV and these kinds of things. And it was a free and fair election, certified as that. And I saw nothing to suggest that it wasn't. In fact, in 2014, I was deployed to the city, what's today called Dnipro. It was essentially the closest large city to the occupied territories of Donetsk and Luhansk. We were pre-positioned to go into those territories to supervise a vote that would happen under Russian occupation should Russia allow it. And they ended up not allowing it. But I mean, there were really serious attempts to make sure that everybody got a shot to vote, that this was done cleanly and clearly. And I would say that the other thing is that there was Russian interference. So the Central Election Commission's computer was taken down. The Ukrainians were prepared for that. And so instead of submitting vote totals from precincts electronically, we actually loaded cars, put observers in them, and drove them 8 hours to Kyiv to turn in ballots and things like that. So it was very serious that the person who would be elected then was considered a legitimate winner, legitimate president, because that person was being elected to run the military to prosecute the war that was going on in 2014.
And this is the election that Poroshenko won. Explain why that caused such a problem.
The previous president had promised to connect Ukraine economically and culturally more with Europe. And that meant business opportunities for Ukraine. It basically meant a rise in living standards for Ukrainians, travel access to Europe, and educational access for Ukrainian students. He had agreed on this, and then at the last minute, he reneged. And then there was investigative reporting that found that essentially he was bribed, which what was, assumed to be, these things aren't really ever sort of 100% proven, but the preponderance of evidence suggested he was bribed with Russian money coming through the Kremlin. And he reneged on this promise. And so students first took to the streets in November of 2013, and occupied Independence Square, Maidan Square in Kyiv. and didn't leave. And the Ukrainian administration at the time, tried to force them out with a variety of tactics. They didn't go. And this was a whole thing that was modeled on the Occupy movement here in the States. So it was very well organized. There was trash pickup and clear places where you could get medical care and food and these sorts of things. I was there in the aftermath. It was extraordinary. Eventually that went on into 2014, and the Ukrainian administration started to use lethal force against them. In the end, about 110 people were shot. There were good reports that other people, journalists and things, were kidnapped and murdered in other parts of Ukraine. And this led in the end to students and others saying, what do we have to lose? And then they forced the president out. And what happened at that point was sort of, at this point, the Russians had invaded, claiming that there were these referendums in the east and later in Crimea to become part of Russia. These were false referendums. And the so-called revolutions that happened in these territories had some local support, were then also supported by Russian special forces and what became known as the Little Green Men. And so the revolution ousted the president, in short. It was kind of a Red Dawn scenario where a bunch of Ukrainian guys, jumped in pickup trucks and got guns and weapons from national armories and headed east to fight the war. And they needed a president to organize this, this mob, as it were, right? This motley crew is a better way to put it, into a real army. And so, and thus began the war in 2014, which is something I think Americans forget. It's been a long war.
Right. It didn't just start 18 months ago. How much effort did the U.S. put behind the overthrow?
So I don't believe that they put any real effort in other than supporting the goal of the protesters. I mean, that's what they did. I don't think that they were feeding anybody intelligence. I don't think that they were, that we had troops on the ground or CIA or things like that doing anything out of the ordinary. They're very careful because they understand that these things get found out, right? And what they're trying to do is gauge essentially and say, do we think this movement can pull this off? And if we do think it can pull it off, which they did, right, had a reasonable chance, then they don't want to ruin that opportunity, with any kind of involvement that they think can be caught. I'm not saying that there weren't some things done in terms of talking to people and kind of low-key advice, but I don't think there was any sort of spy movie stuff going on.
What about the population in those separatist regions? I read that a lot of them consider themselves, like 60% consider themselves Russian. Did they vote overwhelmingly in those regions with the person more aligned with Russian sensibilities than Western sensibilities in that election?
So they did vote for the Russian-leaning candidate for president in Ukraine, the one who was deposed. That's true. But their identity as Russian is an ethnic identity. It's something akin to the U.S. border areas, right? So you have a lot of people of Mexican heritage in the U.S. who think of themselves as Mexican, or I even from 100 years ago think of myself as Volga German, right? Even though I don't speak German, right? I've never been to that region. I have this ethnic identity, but I'm an American first. And so you have a lot of people who think of themselves as Russian in heritage, who nonetheless are Ukrainian citizens, right? And their first language is Russian, but they also generally speak Ukrainian.
Okay.
Again, in the same way that you could go to Texas and California and Arizona, and you could find huge chunks, if not majorities, of the population there. They're going to speak Spanish as their first language that they learned at home, but also speak perfectly fluent English.
All right, perfect. That's a perfect picture. Thank you. Dr. Matthew Schmidt, National Security and Political Science Professor at University of New Haven, been to Ukraine many times, monitored elections. Thank you for painting that picture. I'm going to paint a different picture for our audience. It seems that Russia is now dug in and holds areas east and south of Kharkiv, from the top to the bottom of the east or right side of the map. From the Russian border to the Black Sea, it would be the oblast or state of Luhansk in the northeast, which includes the city of Bakhmut, followed by Donetsk region, followed by Zaporizhia, east of the Dnieper River, through Kherson and down to Crimea, which is where the bridge connecting Russia and Crimea was bombed again last week for the second time. It spans 12-mile wide Kerch Strait, which separates the Black Sea from the Sea of Azov. So I'm just trying to paint a geographical picture in people's mind. Much of the region held total about 18% of Ukraine's landmass. The strip of land is like 110 miles wide by my estimation, 435 miles long. So Ukraine's 90% of the size of Texas, and Russia now controls an area about the size of, say, Kentucky or Virginia. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. I would add also for listeners that Ukraine has a pre-war population of about 44 million. So this is a huge country. It's the size of California, and it would take you, given road systems, it would probably take you 24 hours to drive from west to east. But just think of driving from north to south in California. You have a sense of how big this country is.
The Institute for the Study of War has a live map of Ukraine and the situation there. It charts Ukraine's counteroffensive so far, and it seems sort of stagnant in most areas along that front, the eastern front, I guess you could call it. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, U.S. taxpayers have given a ton of equipment, 160 155 millimeter howitzers. We've given them 154 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 20 helicopters, 2,000 Humvees, thousands of pieces of equipment. I have no doubt that the U.S. has remarkable, unfathomable, untouchable equipment, advanced logistics, everything. The best military in the world. However, how is the equipment that we've supplied Ukraine performing at this point?
Not bad. The Ukrainians are highly technically literate. Again, something to keep in mind is Ukraine was the center of the Soviet missile and space industry, something like Huntsville, Alabama, where they build stuff. So there are a lot of people that understand high-tech military equipment, and Ukraine is doing very well in figuring out how to use these machines on a machine-by-machine basis, on a tactical level. The problem Ukraine has is using them at higher unit levels. Part of what Ukraine is doing in these sectors is trying to train Ukrainian units how to use these vehicles, not how to drive them, not how to shoot from them, but how to use them to get through Russian defenses, how to get through minefields, how to get through trenches. And that's a learning process. And that's what you see happening here in the casualty numbers. In general, individual Ukrainians and small teams know how to drive the thing. They know how to operate the electronics, right? They know all of that stuff. What they're struggling to figure out is how to use this equipment in combination with other equipment. It's like a basketball team where you have a bunch of players who shoot well, but they don't know how to play together as a team yet. So they lose individual games because they're not playing well as a team, not because they don't have the skill set in individuals.
Why is the coverage that I see, and I try to research as much as I can before we go on the air every day, like say in Iraq or wherever, we knew the casualties every day, we were updated. Now it seems we can't get the proper numbers, and we keep hearing that Russia is experiencing severe losses, but some other outlets will say that Ukraine's suffering severe losses. What is accurate? Who's suffering the most?
Yeah. So first of all, in Iraq and Afghanistan, in the war on terror, the U.S. government is being honest about these casualties, and the accounts are much lower. There's independent media there that's able to verify things and keep the government honest on these kinds of things. So that's why you have those better numbers. In Ukraine, the Ukrainian government is hiding those numbers as part of the state secret because strategically it's important to know the total casualty numbers in Ukraine. Russia's doing the same thing, and that's basically why it's hard. The best numbers I've seen for Russia have come out from an independent project from Medusa, which is a media source there that was kicked out of Russia. It's an independent source. They do great reporting, which has verified through a variety of public records that there are at least 47,000 killed in action, Russian soldiers killed in combat, which would indicate that there's probably 200 to 250,000 casualties, meaning people who were injured enough to be taken off the lines and are no longer combat ready. And those numbers in Ukraine are probably half that. You're looking at say, 30,000 dead in Ukraine. What I'm telling you right now are much less accurate, and probably 150 casualties. And of course, Ukraine's a much smaller country and is less able to absorb those numbers.
Okay, and Russia is dug in, as we mentioned, and some areas are more fortified than others. Sectors are broken into, I think, 5 square mile regions or kilometers. So they block key roads, dig in anti-tank trenches from what we hear, place rows of these dragon teeth, which are prefab concrete triangles to stop the flow of tanks. And there's hedgehogs, which look like large jacks that we used to play with as kids. They're blockades on the roads. There's trenches for soldiers, and then you have minefields in between all that. So there are like 3-4 rows of defense and obstacles before Ukrainian forces would actually get to Russian fighters. How effective has the Ukrainian counteroffensive been along those fortifications? And how much land have they grabbed back recently?
Very, very little in the number of handfuls of kilometers. And I would characterize them as being minimally or moderately successful in taking that land. But again, the metric of how much the color changes on the map that you see is, I think, only one metric, and maybe the least important metric of the success of these operations.
Part of the success of the operations is, well, the munitions that we're sending in. President Biden had told CNN that we're low on munitions. So is NATO, apparently. Is Russia more capable of resupplying the munitions? Do they have more output, I guess, than we do at this point?
Yeah, so the two big things that people are looking at here, or three big things, are number of troops and the attrition of troops, meaning the number of casualties that one side can inflict on the other, and the rate of casualties, not just the number. The ammunition, basically what we mean there is artillery shells, and two things. Ammunition in terms of the things you shoot and whether or not you have enough. And you talk about Ukraine's dwindling supplies and the U.S.'s dwindling supplies to send to Ukraine. And then things like tubes, artillery tubes, which wear out because every time these things fire, there's enormous heat produced. And so the tubes gradually become warped, and they're specially manufactured. And so you have to have enough of these tubes to then replace over time. And then air coverage and all that capacity to be able to fight from that dimension of the battlefield.
I hear the stories of press gangs throughout Ukraine. They need young men to go fight. Is this accurate? Are they grabbing men off the streets of, like, say, the Galicia region and sending them in for training with NATO for a couple of weeks and right up to the front line? Or how is the Ukrainian military replenishing its young men?
So I've seen nothing about the press gangs, and I saw nothing there. What I saw was a tired country, a tired populace, but a populace with resolve, and that they were able to maintain, conscription, right? And that they have plenty of volunteers. They are stopping men from the ages of 18 to, I think, 64 from leaving the country. That was very apparent as a male coming in and out of the country, when I traveled there in February. But it is one of the questions. I don't have a clear sense of the total numbers of conscription or total numbers of recruitment, let's say. But I saw nothing about press gangs or anything like that.
Now, the latest news this past week was the bridge in Crimea. Ukraine apparently attacked it. I think this would be the second time. It's a very important structure to Vladimir Putin. He actually opened it and drove a truck across it when it opened in, I think, 2018. How important is that bridge? Because it connects. It's 12 miles long. It connects mainland Russia to Crimea.
So first of all, it's obviously incredibly important in terms of supplying Russian fortifications in Crimea. It is further away. It's less likely to be attacked than the land bridge, which is narrow enough that Ukrainian artillery and long-distance fighters can at least harass shipments there so they can slow it down. So it's very important for that. It's important to remember that if that bridge were suddenly severed and they couldn't bring anything else across it, it would still take months to wear down the supplies that are already stocked in Crimea. But it's important militarily in that sense. It's even more important symbolically because Putin, as you said, opened it in 2018. Putin has justified the war to his population using a narrative about a certain version of the history of Crimea, essentially saying that Crimea is Russian, it's always been Russian, it should continue to be Russian, they're going to take it back. And it's essentially a version of Make Russia Great Again, which is kind of Putin's entire identity, right? It's how he came into power in 1999 and then his first election in 2000 and the elections after. And so were it to fall under the control of the Ukrainians and be severed, it would be a huge blow politically and symbolically to Putin. It would be one of the most important acts of the war.
Russia's population is much larger. Its army is much bigger. Its supply chains are better than Ukraine's at this point. It has a lot of equipment and a lot of men. They're dug in. Does Putin have what he wants at this point for the region we just discussed, the size of Kentucky or Virginia? Is he intent on just holding the line there? Is he showing restraint, or is he just going to go out on an all-out blitz?
There are a lot of reasons to suggest that what he's going to be able to do, and all he can do right now, is essentially hold the line. He can make tactical gains here and there, but it doesn't seem likely that he can capture the whole country, that he can even capture territory to Kyiv. And this is important. He's changed the goalpost for himself many times. And of course, when people do this, they claim they're not choosing the goalpost, but this clearly isn't true. He was trying to take Kyiv. He's trying to politically control the country. What he wanted to do was assassinate Zelensky, put in a puppet government in Kyiv to control its policy towards the West and then towards Russia. He's not going to be able to do that. And in that sense, he's already lost the war. He's not going to be able to take territory. Were he to suddenly break out on the Eastern Front, he would face a guerrilla war of extraordinary magnitude that would prevent him from taking the rest of the country. His casualties would skyrocket. And so he has now limited and publicly created a narrative to say that what he has now is success. And that's what he's trying to hold on to. If Russia holds Crimea, given all of the sanctions and the fact that even without sanctions, that Europe is never going to rely on Russia for oil and gas like it did pre-war again, and the long-term future of the Russian economy, the Crimeans are looking at this and going, look, we're not going to say anything right now because we're a subject population. But if in the end the Ukrainians are going to, win and take us over, we're not going to complain about it.
Gotcha. Okay.
Because we would rather be part of Europe than part of Russia.
Okay. And what about the changing narrative from the U.S. side? We know that Putin's narrative has changed. On the U.S. side, first it was for defense of democracy, for freedom in Ukraine, not regime change. Now it seems to be regime change in Russia, in Moscow. Where do we stand from the United States perspective?
I don't think the U.S. message has changed at all. They're not calling for a regime change in the sense that they're saying we, would justify the assassination of a foreign leader. What they're saying is that Putin's legitimacy and the legitimacy of Russia in the world order is now, not even suspect. It's just not legitimate because it's no longer a democracy. You can't pretend anymore. So they're saying that this is what I've said many times, which is that the war ends in the streets of Moscow. Mm-hmm. Period. I'm 100% certain of that. Whether that happens tomorrow, 5 years from now, or after Putin, right, which is 10 or 20 years from now, I don't know. Ukraine and the West will not be secure until Russia upends its love affair with Putinism as a type of government system and brings in a real democracy.
Okay, we're speaking with Dr. Matthew Schmidt, National Security and Political Science Professor, University of New Haven, been to Ukraine many times, actually. You were there recently. How does this end? What happens to Ukraine? The spoils of war? Is the country divided up? Is it parceled out? What happens to the farmland? Who controls what? There's talk that maybe the United States may want to help rebuild it or provide expertise from corporate farming here in the United States.
Yeah, so let's take that last thing. I actually grew up in Kansas on a dairy and wheat farm. And here's what I've seen with my own eyes. It looks like where I grew up, only the technology is better. The combines are newer, the tractors are newer. They have test plots in the field, just like we had test plots in the field with different varieties of wheat and maize. Again, it's an extraordinarily innovative and modernized country. If you want to imagine, it's like Iowa. And the farmers aren't stupid. They're not doing this stuff by hand. They're not using 40-year-old tractors any more than an American farmer is. And so this is all of that potential that the country has to contribute to the world economy and to Europe. It's going to be after the war, Ukraine will be an enormous contributor to the EU. It will look like Poland did 20 years ago, which now has had a net GDP growth, meaning if you invested $1 in Poland in the year 2000, it would be worth $192 today. That's net. That's after taxes. That's after costs and everything else. And Ukraine certainly has the potential to do that or better.
So is this war really about the control of that farmland? Would it go Russia wants control of it or the EU wants control of it? And how much of the war was about NATO expansion?
No, this is a war about ideology. This has been the basis of my work. Again, 20 years ago, I was writing on this and essentially predicting that something like this would happen. Because Putin thinks of himself and thinks of Russia as being a key part of the historical future of the world. What I mean is he thinks of himself as being a part of Eurasia. And what he means is Russia is distinct. It's not European. It doesn't have a history and doesn't believe in the idea of individual rights like we have here in the United States. It's not a libertarian place, right? So it's not European. It doesn't believe in individual rights on gay rights, right? Or even racial discrimination. There's a lot of discrimination in Russia. It's not Asian. He's sort of saying, like, we're not Chinese, we're not Japanese, we're something distinct. And it's uniquely Christian. And he believes that the heart of Christianity at some point was in Rome. And then when Rome fell in 743 AD, it shifted to Byzantium, which is where the Greek alphabet becomes the Cyrillic alphabet. And then Byzantium falls about a millennium later. And the real heart of Christianity ends up in Moscow with Russian Orthodoxy. And he believes that Ukraine and Ukraine's move towards the West, culturally and economically, right, and militarily, but all of these things represents a threat to that vision, right? If Ukraine becomes a westernized, Europeanized country, then it threatens his vision of this Russian world centered on Moscow, because those ideas will spread to the Russian population. And you see this in how he's passed gay rights legislation in 2014, how much a part of that is in his rhetoric and has been in his rhetoric, how much the anti-democratic stuff has been in his rhetoric. And the problem with him is it's ideological, which means you can't really deter it. He's willing to go to the mat on this stuff because he thinks it's important for God. It's important for world history. And NATO, of course, plays a part of that. It's part of the threat, but it is not the sole thing, and it is not the thing that can deter him.
If he's weakened enough, would China take over parts of Far Eastern Russia? It's an alliance right now of convenience, I guess.
Sure. I mean, that's possible. Certainly they could do that, probably even now from a military perspective. But these are sort of old school ways to think about warfare and old school ways to think about geopolitics. Right? Like, they don't have to physically move in and redraw the border.
No.
In order to have all the influence that they need over that region. They're doing it already.
Okay. And you have been to Ukraine. You were recently there. What is the mood like in, say, Kyiv? The war's raging around it, but what's the mood like in Kyiv?
I would describe it as exhausted, but resilient. Now, I don't think that resilience can last forever. Given the estimated losses in Ukraine, probably everyone in Ukraine is 1 or 2 degrees away from having lost someone in this war. And that takes an enormous toll on family units. And of course, so many people are involved in the war process. And also so many people are struggling to survive because Russia has succeeded in shrinking the economy in Ukraine. And so it's hard. It's really, really hard. But what I saw in terms of the war was, we are now committed, and we are going to win this thing. And I would say, as a student of the region for all of my adult life, part of what hurts me is that Russian-Ukrainian culture, we're close. At one point, the largest Ukrainian city in the world was Moscow. There were 3 million Ukrainians living in Moscow, and 2 million in Kyiv. So these were brother peoples in many ways, coming out of the Soviet Union. And now what you see is Ukrainians are pulling back from that. I don't speak Ukrainian. I can go and I can use my Russian, but I don't do that anymore because it's right, anathema. And so you see that kind of separation now, and Ukraine is never going to go back to being close in that way to Russian culture and to Russia, right? This is going to take decades now. This is in some sense like a civil war, and those are the worst kinds.
How is this going to end? NATO just had a big meeting, but I don't believe there were any Russian emissaries there to talk about the future. How could this war end?
I think what you saw at the meeting, in the lead up to the meeting, was the Biden administration signaled that they are, let's say, lightly pushing Ukraine to bring the major hostilities to an end in the next year. Biden has said essentially, all right, we'll give you the cluster munitions. We won't give you F-16s, but we'll train you on them. We'll let other people give you the airframes. Right? We're essentially going to throw all in on what you say you need. But look, we've got an election coming up. We don't see that this is going to end anytime soon, but we'll give you a shot. We'll give you a year. And wherever you can push back those lines, then when you join NATO, NATO will guarantee them forever.
So Putin's just going to sort of dig in, hold what he has, hoping that he fatigues Ukraine even further, and they just call it a settlement at some point?
I think that's the route we're going. Look, the Russian military is struggling. You saw everything with the mutiny and these kinds of things. It's easier to fight on the defense, even if you have low morale, than to fight on the offense. Just because they're struggling doesn't mean they can't be effective enough on the defense to prevent Ukraine from taking back any large chunks of territory. I think Ukraine has to go for Crimea, which is a huge risk. But I think it's the only thing that they can do that would create enough political turmoil in Russia to get Russia to change their decision-making, right? Change their negotiating position on this. But I think essentially, like I said, the Biden administration is saying, here's your shot, get as far as you can. when you get NATO membership, we will guarantee the borders as they are, and Ukraine can take however many years it takes now to wait out Russia, to become a democracy and renegotiate those borders.
Dr. Matthew Schmidt, National Security, Political Science Professor, University of New Haven. I truly appreciate your insight. You've been there. You understand the culture, you understand the people, and you understand the war. I truly appreciate your perspective and your insight. Thank you so much for your professionalism and joining us today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
You're most welcome. Thank you for the excellent questions. I'm glad to have this chance to do a long-form discussion. I think it clears up what you said at the beginning, which is why do we only hear these snippets in the mainstream media? And you really need to take the time to do this. So I appreciate your commitment to it.